Hello, students. Hope you're all doing well. We are about to embark on modern China. It would seem silly to study the modern world and not include modern China, which has such a massive influence globally and even on our lives here far away in the United States. Um, so let's get deep into it. You're going to have to ignore the strange glare on my glasses. Do you see it? Okay, there it is. Just doing a little fun with that. Anyway, all right, I'm gonna hit the share screen here and let's see what we got. I'm gonna first go over our assignment for the week, um, which will get us going on modern China. Um, Next week, I want to just also remind you, I'm going to start working, having you work in small groups on something to do both with the Cultural Revolution and with contemporary China. There will be an opt-out for that, so if that's something that you don't feel that you can sufficiently participate in, you'll have to do some work on your own. But I'm going to strongly encourage you to get into the group work. It won't be taxing, and it will be a way to benefit from having others share some of that work and ideas. Okay, just again, remember on Wednesday at 12:15 to about 12:45 or 1, we'll have our group session. Check in, say hello, keep our classroom community going, and go over the work, both from last week on Japan and this week on China. And then on Thursday, an extra session where you can just participate and get some of the work done. Okay, we'll do that for about a half hour on Thursday at 3:30 to 4. Okay, let's get into it. So just reviewing here briefly. Little introduction. Always read my introductions. They're short, they're quick. It just kind of frames what we're doing for that week. All right. Most of what you're doing this week is actually watching video. I think it's an incredible video. I actually get pretty emotional watching this movie, and I've seen it, gosh, I don't know, a whole bunch of times. And it's powerful, it's intense, it's just really well put together. And it really gives you an insight to how unbelievably tumultuous um, China is in the modern world. It's not just that the events are big and transformative and quick and violent and uprooting, but it's that so many millions and millions of people are being affected. So modern China is truly just a colossal undertaking to get into with studying the history. And it's so worth it. It's so rich. And this is just a taste. So don't do what I did, which was to not take any Chinese history in college. Take it. Okay. First, you're going to watch this video right now. And some of those items are starred. So make sure you at least respond to some of those. Next, you'll watch about 8 minutes of the video I just mentioned in the early part of the communist era in China, which starts in 1949. Give you some background on that. Then we'll get into this period called the Great Leap Forward. There's about 5 minutes of viewing on the Great Leap Forward. I'll explain that in the notes momentarily. You have another segment here on propaganda. So like the Soviet Union and like so many other authoritarian or dictatorship regimes, art becomes official. And there is art that is allowed and accepted, and there is art that is not. And so you'll see some great examples of Chinese propaganda posters, paintings, but posters. Okay. That item is not starred. Then I'll move you into the Cultural Revolution. There's about 15 minutes of viewing in that segment. And then we'll continue the Cultural Revolution next week and get into contemporary China, looking at the economic transformation after 1989. Okay. So it's actually not a lot of work this week. I'm going to ask you to write at least one question. And then anything you missed, of course, there's a space for that at the bottom. Okay, let's take a look at the notes here. The Great Leap Forward. As you might guess from the name, it's an attempt by China to leap forward economically. China, after 1949, let's say in the 1950s, although it's the beginning of its post-World War II excitement and enthusiasm, and people are enthusiastic. The government, the economy of China is disastrous. There are hundreds of millions of peasants eking out a living from the land. There was an incredibly unfair um, social hierarchy in which landlords control not only land but the wages and labor of these very poor peasants. So China is really not a modern society in any sense in 1950s. And so Mao Zedong, who takes over China after 1949, will attempt with the Communist Party to advance China in very short time from a peasant, poor agricultural society into an industrial giant that can compete with the United States. Okay, so let's take a look first just at leading up to the Communist Revolution of 1949. Okay, we're going to look at four main questions in this unit. Number one, how has rural China transformed? Okay, that'll be our major subject here for the first couple segments. We'll look a bit at how girls' and women's lives have changed. Really interesting. Again, continuing with our sequence on looking at the role of women in history. Is China still communist today? And lastly, is China really that different from its dynastic period, which ends in 1911, 1912? For thousands of years, China was a dynastic society. The Chinese Revolution of 1949 aims to, actually, the Chinese Republic, which begins in 1911 and 12, tries to put all of a dynastic style of government behind it. The question is, does it ever do that? And does Mao, who wages a communist revolution along with the party, is he able to do that? Or is Mao in many ways just a modern form of dynasty? So we'll get into that. Okay, so a little bit of background about Mao Zedong and the revolution. Recall that for thousands of years, China was a dynastic society. Its dominant philosophical influence was Confucianism, you learned about last year. That does not mean that every dynasty was Confucius in nature, but the society itself was Confucius culturally. It does not all come from Confucius the man. He's sort of the origin of the thinking of Confucianism, of course, but that is a type of thinking and philosophy that evolves over time. You might recall the civil service exam and the core relationships that people had to each other, from individual to government, male to female. That was all defined by Confucian philosophy. And so just a few key elements. Girls were subordinate in that philosophy. Of course, that's not unique to any other place in history. Government bureaucracy is overbearing. So part of the idea of Confucian philosophy is that bureaucracy was going to replace privilege, right? That rather than just having emperors and their minions ruling because they were members of the ruling family, instead that people had to demonstrate ability, demonstrate knowledge. In that sense, Confucius was way ahead of his time, extremely advanced, but what it amounts is that this bureaucracy of China becomes a massive presence in people's life, and we'll see the modern version of that under communism. Confucianism is a philosophy as a basis of government that demands adherence to a moral code, which again is kind of a nice thing, right? That government is asking people to essentially be good. Whether or not you like the rules of that goodness is another matter. Okay, so having a moral code, and again, we'll see that strongly emphasized in communist China as well, is that there is a very strong push for personal behavior to adhere to communist code. And again, it's thousands of years of tradition. That does not move easily. Tradition of thousands of years is a very heavy, onerous presence in people's lives. And revolutions, no matter what they promise, cannot just eliminate thousands of years of the past. It has its own inertia. Okay. the modern Republic of China begins in 1911. The Qing dynasty, the last dynasty of China, officially ends. Although it's going to be a couple decades or so of tumult and uncertainty. The great figure from this period is Sun Yat-sen. He becomes the first president of China, but then shortly after relieves himself of that duty, not believing that he was really the right person for that. He was the one that brought China to that point, not alone. But his main thing is to promote nationalism. This is going to be bringing China into the modern period. Dynasties end, modern, liberal, nationalist republic, representative state, yet one that has a unique Chinese character. Just as Mao and communism will have a unique Chinese character of communism that is distinct from Soviet communism. Okay, but as I said, after 1911, there's a period of upheaval. China lacks coherence and unity. And we'll see the growth of these two main political groups, the nationalists and the communists. Communist Party in China is formed in 1921, just 4 years after the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. You might recall that from way back when. Okay, the nationalists, the Kuomintang, is led by Chiang Kai-shek, who was a U.S. ally. United States supported him all the way through World War II against Japan. And the other main group was the Chinese Communist Party. Mao was at the founding meeting of the party and emerges as its leader in a short amount of time. Okay, just a couple images. Chiang Kai-shek on the left, Mao Zedong on the right. All right, Chiang Kai-shek has got a killer outfit, let's be honest. And Mao Zedong has a seriously communist outfit. Okay. Unlike the Soviet Union, the Bolshevik Revolution, which promoted the idea that the industrial working class, the proletariat, was to be the leading force of the revolution, China is going to be all about the peasantry and the agrarian classes, the people in the countryside. That's where the revolution begins. And so it's always going to be a major concern for Mao to bring along the peasants and to insert himself in that milieu. All right, the revolution, as I mentioned before, is an attempt to completely smash the past. Now, initially, that's a big idea, but it's nothing like what happens in the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s to the 1970s, and we'll see that a little bit later. Literally, it's part of the 4 main mantras, which is essentially destruction of the past, not just pushing the past aside, but destruction of the past. And that is a dangerous concept always. Be mindful of that. Okay, 1934 then, the Kuomintang and the communists essentially go out to war against each other. And this is one of the epic chapters of Mao's life, which is the Long March. This is a massive march that is most of a year, 4,000 miles. When the communists retreat from the Kuomintang, who are surrounding them, it's really more than one particular march, but there's one main march. It'll go through village after village after village, and this is going to be a key recruiting maneuver for Mao and the Communist Party to bring these peasants along. They're going to be seen as heroic. And the generation of the Long March, those who were on the Long March and survived it, were going to be the key figures for the next several decades in Chinese history. It's sort of like this major status symbol. Oh, you were on the Long March. Now, many people died on that march. In fact, the vast majority of people did, as we'll see. That began with 80,000 people in this retreat, and only 8,000 reached the end. Now, some of them probably just decided to quit it, but many die along the way. It goes through over major rivers, several mountain ranges, into difficult temperatures. It's long. They're eking out a living on the way, but having peasants support them. It's nearly a year. The conditions are harsh, and it's 50 miles long of marchers, just to give you an idea of how many people there were. But this will build the prestige of Mao like nothing else. The Civil War then gets interrupted in 1937 with Japan's invasion of China. at that point, the Kuomintang and the communists come back together to fight against the Japanese. Now, all the way through the end of World War II in 1945. But then that civil war resumes, the United States on the side of the Kuomintang, who lose. I guess you probably knew that or would have guessed it. The Kuomintang lose, and the, and the leadership of the Kuomintang are going to flee to the province of Taiwan. Now, many of you, maybe all of you, think of Taiwan as an independent country. Taiwan is, depending on your view, a province of China. The Chinese government today, and many Chinese people, consider it a runaway republic, or runaway province, excuse me, of China that still belongs to China. Now, the Taiwanese would have it differently. Some might prefer their notion of an ultimate reunion, but not under communist rule. By the way, if you go to Chinatown, this is probably true of other Chinatowns, Chinatown in Boston, you'll see different flags. You'll see the People's Republic of China, the red flag. You'll see the Taiwanese flag. And throughout Chinatowns and throughout Chinese communities around the world, those two governments are always fighting for loyalty. And so businesses might fly one flag, might fly the other flag. Both governments might invest in Chinatowns and to their immigrant population around the world to, again, push for loyalty and support. You can see a map here of the Long March. Let me get my pointer. Starting over here and then, and then making its way across this massive 4,000-mile territory. All right. So just a nice little image there. China in, 934. There was the 80th in 2014, I guess it was. Yeah, it was the 80th anniversary of the Long March, and China made a big production of that. I think it was the 80th anniversary. Yeah, whatever. Okay, let's move on. So the Civil War, as I mentioned, will begin with the, will interrupt with the Japanese invasion of China, and then resumes after World War II. And you can see there, Taiwan, that runaway province or independent country, depending on your perspective. Just a little propaganda image of defeating Japanese imperialism. Again, there's still a tremendous amount of bitterness against Japan for World War II and particularly its brutality in Nanjing, which I talked about last week. Okay, now we get to our first main subject, which is the Great Leap Forward, 1958 to 1959. It's an unbelievable disaster, this period of time. When you watch the film, you'll see some incredible images. Let me talk about that a little bit here first. Mao is basically impatient for progress. Right? He's trying to advance and push this country into an industrial strength, trying to make the agricultural sector more productive. Recall that the agricultural sector of any agrarian society, but certainly of China, is where the vast majority of the population lives. They are poor. They're the breadbasket. They're producing the food for the urban workers. Now, in the 1950s, the Soviet Union is also playing a major role in China. It was invited to do so. Of course, it has an alliance with China as the other great major communist power. And the Soviets are providing all kinds of technical expertise, all kinds of support in China. China is indebted to them, but of course, kind of really wants to go its own way and eventually will split off from the Soviet Union, believing that it should be prestigious on its own and not really be a subsidiary of Soviet communism. Okay, anyway, so Mao and the Communist Party has invited all these Soviet advisors to China to industrialize. They want to go rapidly from poverty to an industrial power. That's goal number one. Goal number two is really to become a global power that is competing in prestige and economic might with the United States, which of course is the real triumphant winner after World War II. It's the major economy still left standing in the world. Okay. And the other thing is, as becoming a global power, it's the notion that China will demonstrate that communism is the supreme ideology and is better than capitalism. So that's really its goal for the Great Leap Forward. So first thing that has to happen is that Mao is going to transform China. I keep saying Mao, but it's the Communist Party, but really Mao is the major figure. Transform the rural China into a commune system. So again, that's 80% of the population. They're mostly peasants, some landlords. Initially, in early 1950s, they're going to redistribute the land. So you might recall from Guatemala, from Mexico, right? This is a major tenet of socialist or marginally socialist regimes, is to redistribute land, to take it from the rich and give it out to the poor peasants. They're going to redistribute land to 300 million peasants. And peasants are encouraged to rise up and begin to persecute landlords. 1 million landlords were killed during this period. That's a lot of people. That is a lot of people. And they're done so brutally. The next phase is called collectivization. You'll see this in your notes. This is now that the peasants that own the land, the next step is to abolish private ownership of that land and begin to combine those lands. Stalin is going to do this exact same thing, also quite brutally. The collectives then are required to produce a quota. So once a month or whatever the period of time is, a communist official will come to the village and demand X amount of food, right? Some bureaucrat somewhere was supposed to calculate, well, here's the village of this size. It's 10,000 people. They should be able to produce this many bushels of food. So that is the quota. Okay, and that food then, the idea is that it's taken to the cities to feed the industrial workers who are transforming China into this so-called industrial might. But also a lot of that food was being exported to the Soviet Union as a form of repayment for Soviet expertise. Okay, now here's the thing. The quotas were absolutely impossible and unrealistic, but this country is so ideologically driven, so driven by the idea that so driven by its ideas, forgetting the details, forgetting the facts on the ground, forgetting what is really real and existing in people's lives. The ideology, the ruling philosophy was such that communism is so supreme that, of course, not only is it going to meet its quotas, it's going to overproduce. It's going to produce in excess of the quotas. And if your village is not producing as well as the village next door, well, then you're doing something wrong. And the local officials there could be persecuted or put down or go through some sort of pain. So the village leaders were always trying to outdo their neighboring villages. Otherwise, they could be persecuted. And so they were essentially saying, we could produce this much food, and then their quota would be raised for the next month. Thing is, they couldn't produce that much food. So they were giving away more food than they could afford, and people began to starve. Okay, again, they were giving away not only to meet their quotas, but sometimes exceeding their quotas to try to make themselves look good. But it was too much. There was not enough food left over for the people in the village to actually eat, and so that's the disaster of the Great Leap Forward. Initially, though, there's this immense amount of optimism. You'll see this in the film. It's presented really well. Farmers are sleeping in their fields. They're working all the time. They're collectively with their, commune neighbors singing slogans. They have communal nurseries and cooks. It's supposed to be the socialist paradise. And there's some nice things about that, people looking out for each other. But it came at great expense. The next major aspect of the Great Leap Forward, which is such a disaster, was that China said it needed to make steel. Steel is going to be the powerhouse of this industrial economy. And so it tells people, go make your own steel. We'll make it in the cities, but everyone should engage in making steel. Melt down your pots, melt down your tools, melt down your utensils, all your nails. People begin to destroy and burn their properties to make steel in these backyard furnaces. They deforest 10% of the forests in China just to heat the flames. So I don't know a whole lot about the process of making steel, but basically you melt down iron and you remove the impurities, and what's left is supposed to be this strong material. So they were making steel, but it was crap, right? It would break, it would crack. The furnaces were not hot enough. You needed a high-tech operation to make steel, unless you're medieval Japan that was, making these masterful steel swords hundreds of years ago, but they weren't building buildings out of it. They were building, producing swords. So that's a complete failure. Not only do people burn up their forests, create a lot of smoke and pollution. But they spend a lot of time, a lot of labor, and lose a lot of property in the process. It's a complete fiasco. The phrase of the time was we were going to launch satellites to heaven. This is the late 50s. The space age is on. It's a metaphor that China is going to, there's just kind of no ceiling to what they can do. They'll produce way more food than actually is needed. You have an image here, you'll see this in the movie as well, of these backyard furnaces that is supposed to make steel. All right. As I said, there's a propaganda image section. It's not a starred item, but it's pretty interesting. We'll have another opportunity for great Cultural Revolution propaganda next week. Here's an example of one of them. And this one's called Start the Movement to Increase Production and Practice Thrift, with foodstuffs and steel at the center with great force. 1960, just after the end of the Great Leap Forward. You see this classic image of these two workers, big, looking forward, looking bold, looking strong, or smiling. He's holding up steel, she's holding a bushel of wheat. Below or in front of them are the people marching forward together. A lot of red. A lot of red is the color of communism and of China. All right, so you'll have a couple of opportunities to analyze some of the propaganda images. All right, so why the famine? I sort of explained it, right? But again, there was pressure on the collectives to demonstrate their massive success, and the officials, they take too much food. There's not enough for people to eat. Not only that, they engage in just bad agricultural practices. Again, these are not agricultural specialists. They're Communist Party officials dictating agricultural policy. Right? Whenever a country gets into firing or removing or ignoring the experts, and instead looking to politicians to explain technical matters, say like public health or pandemic or climate science, right? Whenever the people who really understand that stuff are sideswiped, what you end up with is calamity. And you can look out your window and see the effect of that right now. All right, that was a little opinion piece by me. All right, and not only that, but anyone who criticized Mao. So if you were an official that you had some expertise in agricultural policy or had some insight in economics, or you just thought, this idea is not going to work, or you know what, we're seeing people beginning to starve, that was seen as criticism. Recall the French Revolution, right? Recall the Great Terror. This is that same dynamic again of a revolution becoming too extreme. And Mao begins to purge, that is, to remove people. By doing so, he puts fear into everybody. And that fear leads to intense conformity. And that is the major power grab of dictatorship, of a totalitarian society, is one that, again, accuses everyone. Everyone is presumed guilty before innocent. Everyone is suspect. Therefore, everyone is fearful, and they conform. They essentially go along with what they're being told. They stop trusting their family members. They stop trusting their neighbors. They start reporting on family members and neighbors just to make sure that they look clean. We'll see this become way more extreme in the Cultural Revolution. All right. By the time the Great Leap Forward ends, the after effects of this famine is that 30 million people die. It's probably the largest famine in human history. And it was really, some of your parents, certainly your grandparents, were alive at this time. Okay. I think that is the end of the Great Leap Forward slide. So let me close that out. Just double check. Yeah. Let's move to the Cultural Revolution just briefly. Just going to introduce that to you this week, and then you'll have a little bit more of that with some interesting activities next week. Okay. So this is now 1966 to 76. One thing to keep in mind is that after the Great Leap Forward, Mao retreats from public life. And you'll see in the beginning of the film that you'll watch for this segment, Mao re-enters public life again. And he does this big media moment where he goes to the Yangtze River and swims. And he's like, an older guy at this point, and he's going to do this big, vigorous swim in this large river to demonstrate his vitality, his strength. That's going to be his comeback. I think it's 66 when he does that swim. But before that, he retreats because the Leap Forward was such an epic disaster. And he wants to kind of escape the criticism, which of course could get someone in trouble, but he pulls away. All right. Keeping our 4 questions in mind, we're still focusing on the first question here about the transformation of rural life in China. Okay. 1966, then Mao unleashes the Cultural Revolution. He comes back into public with a vengeance and regains control, which he'd sort of lost control of. He basically creates this group called the Red Guard. These are youths. These are people your age, a little bit younger, a little bit older, and gives, he's going to have this group kind of be out front, which is going to give him protection from criticism. They are going to be encouraged to rise up against the elderly, against the business class, against anyone who's not seen as pure communists. And this is going to insulate Mao from any kind of criticism, because this force of youth is going to essentially come out very aggressive into the streets. We'll have a really powerful segment of video that we'll watch from a different film, a feature film, next week. I tell you, I cry every time I watch it. It's intense and beautiful and amazing. Okay, so Mao's going to unleash this new revolution from within the revolution. By the way, Stalin, after he died in 1956, I think it was widely criticized for his excess, for the massive amount of death. And Mao wants to avoid this. So he's going to insulate himself by creating this group called the Red Guard. All right. And what he tells people to do is now to struggle against the party that he leads, right? He's basically saying that, you know what, the party is not truly revolutionary. We need to push the revolution further. So I'm going to create this group of Red Guard, these very aggressive, young, intensely loyal, conformist group who are going to hit the streets and put, fear into everybody and beat people, beat the elderly, destroy property, but put people on edge, with the warning that if you are not a true revolutionary, you might call yourself a communist, you might even be a member of the Communist Party, but if you're not acting purely as communist, recall what I said at the beginning about Confucian moral code, right? This is now develops into a communist personal moral code. And anyone who does not demonstrate that in intensity can be struggled against. Okay, it's essentially a coup from below. It's a civilian mob. It's going to put a check on the old guard, the old party leaders. Mao is going after his comrades that he fought with on the Long March and essentially built China on with this youth corps. All right, it's basically taking the revolution and trying to purify it. These are really dangerous ideas. He says the revolution is a continuous revolution. There's no end to it. And we need to continually purge or remove counter-revolutionaries. It's the reign of terror. This is the reign of terror. All right. The Red Guard is a youth that is supposed to struggle against the four olds. Okay. We'll see images of this next week, but I'll say a little bit about it now. But this is not an uncommon image of people holding the little red book, Mao's red book. You might remember I had a copy of it in the classroom with these massive posters of Mao. Mao begins to achieve cult status, and you have young people, teenagers, early 20s, carrying around their red book at all times, reading it in big public settings, having mass rallies, lots of flags and banners, and it's dangerous. So the main idea here is to destroying the four olds is to destroy history. They begin to change street names. They burn books. They raid homes. They seize property. Remember in the Reign of Terror, the French Revolution began to change. They actually created a whole new calendar, right? They got rid of many elements, or at least tried to, of traditional French culture. All right. This kind of totalitarianism begins to break down and wear on social relationships. It's a constant struggle against anything old, including older people. Anyone who's an intellectual is seen as too bourgeois, too uppity. not truly revolutionary as they sit behind their desk and study and read and write. They should be out in the fields with the peasants, being true revolutionaries, right, is the idea here. Elders, which have family status in traditional China, lose some of that family status. And so Mao begins to break down Chinese society. There's a breakdown in justice, right? No longer is there a system of justice. People are now moving their obedience to Mao, to the person. It's not about laws. It's not about government. It's about the cult of Mao now. So an accusation doesn't lead someone to court. An accusation equals a conviction, right? The mobs replace the courts. Simply being suspected equals guilt, again, like the Reign of Terror. People now are engaging in this blind obedience, some through fear, some because they're true believers. There's only official thought. There's conformity, a breakdown of individual thought. So breakdown in trust, breakdown in social relationships, breakdown in individual thoughts, right? That is the aim of a totalitarian society, which controls your personal life, right? I mentioned the four olds. There are people just in the streets destroying relics. They go into museums. Old Buddhist statues and temples are broken down. Books are burned. Elderly people are beaten. And people would beat and sometimes kill their friends' grandparents. So the four olds were old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. And these are the things that needed to be destroyed. And there were all sorts of struggle sessions where elderly people, anyone accused, would wear these banners, these accusatory banners around their necks. They wear these massive dunce caps. They'd be paraded and dragged through the streets. People had to bow their heads. They'd be these big public sessions that were designed to humiliate and to physically harm people. And in this video clip we'll watch next week, which is so intense, you'll see some of this stuff happening in the streets. It's an incredible film. It's called To Live. The whole thing's on the internet. You can watch it. It's powerful and it's painful. And it's just an incredible film made by a Chinese filmmaker in the 1990s. All right. Again, lots of propaganda posters. This one's called Scatter the Old World, Build a New World, 1967. Right, it's all about smashing the old and building the new, and it's very youth-driven. And so we end up with this massive tension between, on the one hand, revolt against tyranny and oppression, but that revolt and that struggle becomes so extreme that people become unquestioning in their faith in a cause. They begin to ignore truth and knowledge. And I don't want to draw too close of an analogy, but this week, sadly, in Brazil, the President Jair Bolsonaro continues to just flout all public health expertise. Right? He goes out in the streets, he greets people, he hugs people. He's not wearing a mask. Brazil now has the second most number of cases of COVID-19 in the world. And the president is still calling this a minor flu. Right? And yet he's got these people who are desperate enough that voted for him because of the pain they were experiencing. And they are just loyal followers. So Brazil certainly had legitimate issues of poverty and inequality, but to support a populist who just eschews all sorts of technical ideas and technical information and expertise in public health because he's going to be their hero and savior at their own peril is a dangerous, dangerous thing. We see a moderate version of that here in the United States as well, as experts, as the bureaucrats, as the 2 million people who work for government are beginning to leave those jobs for the federal government because their expertise and their know-how and their years of experience working for Democrats and Republicans are being just ignored. Again, I don't want to draw too close of an analogy at all to the Cultural Revolution in China, but it's a dangerous thing when people begin to attack expertise and experts as being against the people, as being a secretive government. And that is certainly not the case here in the United States. So let's just end it. Is there anything else here? Yeah. Last thing, I guess, is that the Red Guard becomes so extreme that, and many of them are tied to party officials. They're the children often of party officials, and many of the less privileged children in China believe, well, they're being excluded, so they form their own Red Guard, and before you know it, you have different groups of Red Guard literally attacking each other in the streets. And Mao lets it happen. He lets this just fester. But other party officials finally persuade him, you've got to put a stop to this. So he tells those youth to go out to the countryside. They're called the sent down youth. They're sent down for punishment and for re-education. And what they are, the mission they're given is to go to the countryside and to learn from the peasants. The peasants, by nature of being peasants, are regarded as the true revolutionaries. You know, what they are really is just true to themselves by trying to prevent themselves from starving. But they are regarded, because of being peasants, as having the wisdom of the working class, of a true revolutionary. And so this is how Mao kind of breaks down the Red Guard by sending them, many of them, out to the villages. Anyway, you'll see some great footage of this in the videos this week and next week. So with that, I'll leave it here. And that's it. Have a great one. And hopefully I'll see you on Wednesday. Okay. Take care.